Hi, everyone. We want to welcome you to this webinar, Understanding the IEP for Paraprofessionals. We're really looking forward to this. For the next hour or so, we will be talking all things IEP.
So today, the session outcomes, we're going to want you. Okay, I'm Linda Lawrence. I'm an IA at Andover High School, and I've been there almost 20 years. And I've done everything from one-on-one small classes to now I'm inclusion, math, and science.
I'm Stephanie Hand. I've been teaching at Andover High School as a special educator for over 20 years. I usually am in small, substantially separate classrooms, but I've also done inclusion classrooms in biology and physical science, and I've been working with Linda for most of those 20 years.
I'm Helen Fitzgerald. I'm a speech-language pathologist. I also work at Andover High School. In preschool and elementary school. I've also worked with college-age students and adults, so I kind of have the whole spectrum as we go through this, so hopefully we'll be able to hit all of the areas that you work in.
Everybody right now is muted, so we can't hear you, but if you have questions, please type them into the chat box and send it to as they come up, we'll be able to answer your questions. So there is going to be some dialogue here.
Okay, so today we're going to cover the IEP process, the special ed jargon, and collaborating with teachers. It's collaboration with teachers and also with the specialists in your building. We have been working together as a team for more than 10 years, and that's why we do this workshop. It's fun for us, and it makes good relationships.
So we're going to start off with the special ed jargon. Like everything, special ed has a language of its own. The first term that's really important is FAPE. It stands for Free and Appropriate Public Education, and it's one of the cornerstones of special ed law. The definition you have up there is from the DESE website, from a little pamphlet called Parents Guide to Special Education, and this is something that's really, really useful to download and to look at. It's got every vocabulary term that you're going to need, and it's also got what most savvy parents need to know and special ed law. Basically, free and appropriate public education means that students who have disabilities get the same education that their non-disabled counterparts do. The second jargony term is LRE, or the least restrictive environment. What that means is that students should be taught in the environment where they can be the most successful, and which is closest to what the general ed population gets. So basically, it's more on an individual need. The least restrictive environment is within a general education classroom with accommodations or with whatever help the student will need to be successful. However, some students can't be successful in a large classroom. And so there are other settings, and again, there's a gradation of what the least restrictive environment is. What could be the least restrictive environment for one student might be too restrictive for another student. So this is much more on an individual basis. All of this is predicated on the idea that the student will make effective progress in the curriculum. Effective progress is progress in a number of areas. It's not just in acquiring knowledge and skills. It includes how students are developing in terms of their social and emotional development. It can be within the general education program. It can be with or without accommodations. But it's also based on how old the students are chronologically and what is expected developmentally. When we talk about effective progress, we talk about the potential of a child, and we also talk about the Massachusetts Learning Standards. This is basically very individualized, and it's based on teacher, parent, and evaluator input. And that is really important where you come in, because teachers rely on your observations and your insights, whether you're a one-on-one instructional assistant or paraprofessional, whether or not you're a classroom paraprofessional, working with small groups or working within the entire large general ed classroom. So your input is incredibly important in determining whether or not effective progress is being made. Effective progress has to be documented growth. And again, we can't emphasize the fact that you are working with students on individual educational programs where you have special important knowledge of their growth.
Okay, so when we start to look at what an IEP is, the first thing is it's called an individual education program, but really we all just call it an individual education plan. It really is a plan. It's kind of our user's guide to what works best for each student. It's a legal document, and we have to treat it that way. So once this document is created and signed, we really have no choice but to follow what it says. So it's not an option or a suggestion. We all have to follow the plan. It's really important to understand that this is one of the ways that we have to come together as a team to try to do what's best for our students. So when we say it's a communication vehicle for the parents and the school personnel, that's for all of us to be able to put to give our input so that we really do what is best for our students.
So, so for the collaborative process, let's talk about parents. It's best for us to have a really great relationship with the parents, especially in the younger grades. Parents can be highly effective in carrying over, especially social skills that you want or habits that you want to instill in the child. Their follow-up is really helpful. Of course, some parents are going to be great, and some parents can be your worst nightmare.
They all kind of come from a place of...
They come from a place of trying to do what they think is right for their child. It's not always the best decision making. So the goal is for the IEP team is to guide them to more of what the student needs.
When you're working with kids in the younger grades, these students aren't going to be at the IEP meeting, but when students turn 14, they are expected to go to their IEP meeting and participate. And they do get an invitation, and it is, and they do have to be there. If they don't want to be there, their parents can excuse them. But the rule is, as students get older, we want them at meetings, because if they don't buy into the IEP, it's not going to be as effective.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you have an IEP meeting, the team includes the students, general ed teachers, special ed teachers, paraprofessionals, specialists, which can be speech language professionals, anyone that's working with your child, reading specialist. ETFs is a term we use in Andover, and that's who's chairing the meeting. So it's someone from the special ed department that has that role. They're going to chair the meetings. Administrators can be there, advocates if the parents have an advocate or a lawyer, and sometimes we're asked to be there. It seems like over the last 20 years that I've been doing this, we've been asked less and less, and now it's pretty much none. We want to think about when we're interacting with the student, what their strengths and needs are and how that disability affects their learning.
Yeah, we really want all of us to come together, everyone on the team, to just help us understand what's going on with the student and what we can do best to support the student so they can be successful in their academics and outside of academics.
And also, as a teacher, I can't emphasize enough how important your input is. There are times that you work so closely with students that you have a really important input, and you need to tell the teacher that who's also working with the student what you've observed.
Yes. Yeah. So when we look at the overarching goals of special education, ultimately our goal is to provide our students with access to an appropriate education with the skills necessary to be successful in whatever comes next for them. And that's kind of important for us to consider. It's really the whatever comes next for them. It doesn't necessarily mean that every student will follow the same track. That is not appropriate when we consider where each student is coming from. But we really want them to be ready for whatever happens for them when they leave our system. The end game is that we have adults who are active and engaged members of their communities to the extent their abilities and their personalities allow. So we're looking for independence when someone enters the special ed environment, even though sometimes it seems like once a student enters special ed, he never leaves. That's really, for us, that is not the end game. The end game is that we want them to be independent. And for some students, that might be a year or two. And for some students, that might be for their whole career. It's important to understand that we provide student services from age 3 to 22. But if a student takes a diploma, then their services end with us. So we do not work with them until they're 22. Some of our students who have more significant needs will stay with us through the age of 22. When that happens, on the day they turn 22 is the day our services end. So it doesn't matter whether it's the first day of the school year, the last day of the school year, or anywhere in the middle. Once they reach their 22nd birthday, then we no longer provide services and they will enter into the world of adult services. So I also want to talk about this issue of what access means. So access doesn't necessarily mean success in some instances. It means that we will provide what is necessary to level the playing field for our students so that they can be involved with the education curriculum to the extent possible. And that, again, will look different for different students. It really is very individual when it comes to this. And the other thing is, some of these terms can be kind of vague. So this idea of what is the potential as a learner. No student is just a set of numbers. And I've seen plenty who seem to have low potential based on the numbers from their evaluations, who have gone on to do some pretty amazing things. And conversely, I've seen students whose numbers suggest that they should be highly successful, and for different reasons, they do not kind of meet what the numbers suggest. So when we're looking at this idea of potential, we really have to kind of look at the whole human being.
So talking about our role as an IEP team member, it's very fuzzy. And one of the first things you should do is to read your contract, because that's going to give you your job description, things that you shouldn't be doing, things that you should be doing. Typically, we're not required to go to meetings. This is a big change from 20 years ago, for the worse, I think.
Me too.
Teachers that you're working with or specialists that you're working with may ask you for information about the student, and they can bring that to the meeting. At times, you may be requested because of the information that you have, especially if you're a one-on-one. You have a lot more insight into the day-to-day life of that student than anyone else. So just check your contract and be open to going to meetings, because it's a good thing.
So when we look at the referral process, this can be different in every school and different grades and different school systems. But lots of people, we start with a referral, and lots of people can request referrals. Typically, it's parents who are requesting referrals, but sometimes guidance counselors will do it, social workers, teachers. So really, it's any adult who works with the child, so including you, can potentially start a referral process for a student that we suspect might have a learning issue. So once we have a referral, the process goes like this. We have 30 days to complete any evaluations that we decided. Then within 45 days, we have to have sent home reports and held a meeting to make a determination. So the evaluation will determine the studies, but it's the team who decides whether a student is eligible. So one of the interesting parts about this is a student can have a disability but still not be eligible for an IEP. We have questions we have to ask, and the first one is, does this child have a disability? The second question we have to ask is impacting their ability to access the curriculum? So if the answer to that is no, then a student would not be eligible for an IEP. So they have to answer both of those. You want to add something?
Yes, the other thing is there are specific disability categories that are mandated.
Yes, there are, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit, but there are specific categories that they do have to fit under. So the other kind of frustrating part of this is you might be working with students who are in the process of being referred, and this student will be missing classes, and that might actually worse, so he will fall further behind, and that can be frustrating for us to watch, but there's really no way around this. We have to have that information before we can have a student get the services that they need. They have to be determined as eligible. The most common assessments that we look at are psycho-educational, where we look at cognitive skills, and an academic evaluation where we typically look at math and writing skills. But depending on the presenting question, then you might also have speech evaluations, reading evaluations, occupational therapy evaluations, physical therapy evaluations, assistive technology evaluations. So the list goes on depending on where we think the question, where the problem may be.
So we want you to think about how you actually get hold of the IEP so that you can use it the way it's meant to be used. In our district, there are basically 3 ways, and they're pretty universal ways. The special ed office keeps a hard copy of the actual plan, a copy that gets sent home to the parents as well. It's also online. We use a system called Aspen as the online component, but there are other platforms like SPED, and again, different schools use different platforms. The third way is more personalized way. You can go to the case manager for the student or the classroom teacher. They all should have access to the IEP, and so should you. So think about what you do in your district and how you actually can have access to the IEP, which you need to do your job and help your student.
So the first thing that is covered in an IEP meeting is parent and student concerns. Obviously, as the child gets older, the student concerns will become more relevant. This is where you get to know what they actually are hoping for, what's going on that they want to address, and it gives you a lot of focus on what you need to do with the child. And it's going to change every year. As they get older, homework amounts could change, social emotional supports could change. So every year you need to be looking again at the IEP.
So this next page, the Student Strengths and Key Evaluation Result Summary, it's a pretty important page. It gives you a lot of information that can help you understand and connect with your students. So I always suggest that you take a look at this page and spend a little time on it. This one names the disability. It also tells us what the scores are on the tests that are used to determine the disability. It gives us standardized test results like MCAS. You know, we call it a summary, but it actually tends to be pretty lengthy because there's a lot of necessary information in there that can really be helpful when you're working with the student. So there may be one disability that we see listed, but sometimes we see secondary disabilities listed too. So, for example, we might have a student with ADHD and that is his primary disability, but there may also be another disability of anxiety listed. So it's important that you kind of look through this and see what it is where the difficulties actually lie. Now, when you look at the DESE website, they talk about 10 different disability categories, and those are autism, communication impairment, so speech and language, listening, writing, speaking, and hearing. There are developmental delays, and this is a category for students aged 3 to 9. There are emotional impairments. There are health impairments like ADHD or hemophilia or a student with heart conditions. There are intellectual impairments, neurological impairments such as traumatic brain injury. We sometimes see physical impairments that have to be addressed. There are sensory impairments that include hearing, vision, and a combination of those, so someone who is deaf and blind. And then finally, there's this category of specific learning disability, and lots of things can fall in that category. Often we see a specific learning disability in mathematics or in written language. So those are the 10 areas, and a student must fit into one of those disability categories with the relevant evaluations to kind of back it up in order to start this kind of IEP process. But again, really, I would like you to be looking at it just so it helps you understand who you're working with and maybe ways that you can connect with them through their strengths.
There's also a place on the IEP for the vision statement where the parents, what the parent's vision for their child is, what the school's vision for their child is, and when the child is old enough, what the child really thinks. And this changes every year. This is one thing that is not legally binding. If parents think that their child is going to be going to a 4-year college and becoming a lawyer, and the child wants to be a professional baseball player, it really, that's fine. Every year things change, and so it's pretty interesting to look at this because you get an appreciation for where everybody's coming from, what the parents hope for, what the student hopes for, and what the team expects or hopes for.
Sometimes the vision might just say that for the parents, it might be that my child will be happy in the next few years, or that my child will have friends. You know, sometimes they might say that They're hoping that their child will learn to do homework a little bit more consistently. So the vision can really be anything from 1 to 5 years. Okay, so then we have, don't ask me why there are boxes up there. I have no idea why. I tried to get rid of them earlier and I couldn't. So when we're looking at, now we're going to look at this PLEP A. And PLEP A stands for Present Levels of Educational Performance. So big name, but really what this is how we have to talk about how does this disability actually affect the progress in these curriculum areas. So that's the first thing that we list. The next thing we talk about is what are the accommodations that we need for the student to be able to actually access the curriculum. And then third, we talk about if there's going to be any type of specially designed instruction, like from occupational therapy or reading or speech language, in order for the student to make the necessary progress that we want to see, or effective progress, along with any of the accommodations that we might be doing. So this is another really important page for you to be looking at, because the disabilities listed in the strengths section are kind of explained here. So the accommodations that are listed are legally binding and they have to be followed, and you may be asked to follow them. A lot of times these accommodations are just kind of things that you're doing anyway as good practice. You know, you kind of know when it's helpful to repeat something for a student or show them a visual. So a lot of it's just good practice that many of you are already doing. So, but you really need to be aware of that because the accommodations are legally binding as well.
So we wanted to make one thing really, really clear for this. There's sometimes the words accommodations and modifications are used they're used interchangeably, and they're not interchangeable. Legally, there is a difference. When you give a student an accommodation, you're changing the environment, the format, or whatever equipment is needed to let a student access the content or to do what you're asking them to do. You're not changing the curriculum. You're not changing the assessment. Any student with accommodation is being graded on the same grading scale. You're you're leveling the playing field to make it possible for them to access the curriculum, the exact same curriculum that everyone in the class is getting.
Mm-hmm.
Modifications are different. Modification changes the curriculum. And it's for students who really, they are being taught for a variety of reasons. Modifications can change the nature of the assessment, and modifications can include a different grading scale. So if you are accommodating a student, you're doing certain things to help them. If you are modifying the curriculum, you are actually changing the curriculum. You're changing what is being taught, not just how it's being taught. One other thing that we want to really stress is that paraprofessionals or instructional assistants, whatever the nature of your job is, you do not make the modifications.
Right.
You implement them.
Mm-hmm.
And if a teacher asks you to modify something for a student, that's the teacher's job. You will implement any modification that's on the IEP, but it is not your responsibility to actually make those modifications. The other thing is there are gray areas, and you're going to see that in just a minute, about whether or not you're accommodating the student or you're modifying for the student. So please, as we move forward. The next slide has a chart, and this is something that is very individualized. this is something that's a really helpful way to organize your students with special needs. If you're in an inclusion class, you're going to have anywhere from 2 to maybe 10, maybe 12 kids who are on IEPs, and they all have a variety of accommodations and or modifications. And you really do need a good way to get a handle on all of your students. This is what we use, and we've come up with this as a way to show it, but you can use this in any way you want, any way that works for you. And all it is a grid with the students' names, but you have to be careful that because of privacy issues, so initials are better. With the student's name goes the disability, and sometimes there are more than one. So if you go down to the very bottom one, that student has autism as the primary disability, but also has ADD, has anxiety and executive functioning issues as well. Across the top, in this case, there are a list of some of the most common disabilities that you will see on an IEP, and they're abbreviated. They're my abbreviations, so PS stands for preferential seating. Queuing means you have developed a system of queuing to have the students, to cue the students to certain behaviors. You may be asked to take notes and provide a copy of notes for different students because that's what's on their IEP. They may need motion breaks or sensory breaks in the day. You may have to check in with them at various times. You may have to chunk language. You may have to reword information. So you can come up with your own abbreviations based on the accommodations or modifications that are on the student's IEP. It's a handy way of working with the students when you have a number of kids who have disabilities in your classroom. The other thing that's nice is if you notice that a student never takes a sensory break in class, there's room at the bottom of the chart for you to make a note of it. And that's really good information for an IEP meeting. You can just say, the student has never used that accommodation in the last 3 months. So maybe it's not necessary. And again, it's information that should be discussed at the IEP meeting. So a chart like this is very helpful for yourself and for the teacher that you're working with.
You can also use this just as you create a daily routine. So you might, as you enter the classroom, be saying, okay, let me first make sure that everyone has the seat that they need, or let me just make sure that I check in with these 5 students, or let me just make sure that the student has their binder in order. So it can be a nice way to just set up a daily routine for yourself as you're, working with your students and developing those relationships with them. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about accommodations versus modifications. It's really important that we understand if we're doing accommodations or modifications. All of us want to help our students as best we can so that they can be successful. We go into this field because we want to help people. We want to help our students. Sometimes we might do more for them than they need. So we have to be really careful when we're looking at accommodations and make sure that we give those accommodations the way that they are intended and don't do more for our students than is listed. What I mean by this is sometimes we say we're accommodating a student when really we're modifying, so we're changing the curriculum. And if that's the case, it sets up kind of an unfair perspective or perception that the student is able to do more than they really can. And we really don't want that to happen. So it's very important that we understand when we are just making changes so that the student can access the curriculum versus changing the content. So to that end, when you have a list of accommodations and or modifications up here, and what I want to say about this piece is that sometimes these are going to be considered an accommodation and sometimes they might be considered a modification. So for instance, if we talk about giving students a reduced number of homework items, well, that can be an accommodation if the students are still required to do the same types of homework items. So the way I explain this one is kind of like in history when kids have to answer questions at the back of the history book. And in the beginning, there'll be questions that just say, find basically the bold-faced words. So what are the important concepts? Who are the important people? Then as you get into it, you might find more stuff about factual information. And then at the end are those really hard questions that drive us all crazy, and they have a lot to do with analysis and synthesis. So if I say that a student only has to do the first two questions, I'm actually changing the curriculum because that student is not required to do the same level of work and do the higher level thinking that other students are required for. So we have to be really careful to decide, okay, is this an accommodation? Because if it's an accommodation, that student will have to do one of the bold-faced word questions, one of the factual questions, and at least one of the analysis questions so that it has not become a. I hope that this makes sense. If you have time at the end of this, if you want to try to think about it for yourself, you need to really look at, gee, is this changing the curriculum? So sometimes when you watch a film instead of reading a text, you're changing the curriculum because you're not giving the exact same type of information. So you might be providing something that is an abridged version or a shortened version of what the text actually is. But other times, you can give a film and say the film is about whales and facts about whales, and it might cover the same information that you would see in a text. In that case, it would still be an accommodation. So when you think about this, you have to really think about what am I doing for this student? Am I changing the work that they're doing so that the curriculum changes, or am I just giving them the support they need so they can do all the work that everybody else is doing? Okay, now we come to this other part of the IEP, and it's called PLEP B. So PLEP A is really related to the curriculum and the frameworks that we look at. PLEP B is more related to participation in the overall life of school. So it doesn't necessarily address things that we'll see in our frameworks or what the teachers actually need to teach in the academic classes. It also relates to areas of life skill and or age-specific skills. So when we think about communication needs, if the communication or the speech-language skills of the student are impacting the ability to understand what's happening in the classrooms, that's PLEP A. But if the speech-language skills are impacting a student's ability to join groups and after-school clubs or manage a job, then that is an area that we look at under PLEP B. So it spells out the requirements that, that we need for consultation and collaboration with specialists as well. This is another page that you should be looking at because often the specialists will be adding information here that will impact the classroom but also impact other areas of our students' life.
One of the most important parts of the IEP are the goals that the students are working on. The IEP, we have IEP meetings once a year, and then every third year, there is a reevaluation. The area for the goals, it can include a whole number of things that are based on what their disability is. So again, it can be written language, it can be study skills, it can be math, it can be written or oral language skills. Students can have a social emotional goal. So there are a variety of areas where goals can be written. Some students have 1 or 2 annual goals. Some students have considerably more, and this also changes based on the age and the education level of the student.
Can I just add to this, if you're okay with that? When we're writing our goals, when we list what the current level of performance is in a goal, we really wanted to include what a student can do. So when we think in terms of strength-based IEPs, we want to list all the things that our students can do. Many times when we look at IEPs, we see all of the things that a student cannot do listed in the current level of performance. And I think that that does students a disservice. So we want to be thinking in terms of where are their actual strengths. So when we looked at our assessments, where are the areas that they can function well within this goal area? And then we start from there. That should be the point, the stepping off point, not that all of the things they can't do. We need to start with where are they at, and then look to see what are the objectives we need to meet that goal.
You are working directly with your students on their goals. And so it is important that you do look at this piece of the IEP. There are, again, a couple of parts to this. There's the current level, as Helen said. And then there's the goal itself. The goal should be able to be completed within 1 full year, the length of the IEP. The goal should say what the student is expected to do. It should be measurable as well. So there should be a way of assessing how the student is doing as he works throughout the whole year on this goal. As part of the goal, there are also benchmarks and objectives. If you think about the goal being the big overarching umbrella, the objectives are the things you need to do in order to complete the goal. In addition, the objectives, again, have to be measurable, and there has to be a time frame involved, so that if you're looking at goals and objectives, that will be kind of a roadmap for where the student should be as the year goes along. Progress reports are written by special ed teachers that are sent to parents approximately the same time that the student receives a report card. And this is like the report card on where they are working towards the goal, not necessarily their classroom grades, but how far along towards their goal are they? And again, parents get them every time the student gets a report card.
And once again, this may be an area where teachers will ask you to either take some data on or provide some information about how the student is doing with the practical application of these in the classroom, especially if they're curriculum related. So it is important that you do understand what the student is working on, and hopefully you will be working on some of that with them within the context of whatever's happening in the classroom. All right, so as we go through the IEP, the next page that we come to is the service delivery page. And there are 3 different ways that we provide service to a student. For the first one, consultation. This is when whatever the goal or the area is that we're working on, we don't work directly with the student. We work with other school personnel. And you'll often see specialists listed here, and they'll be consulting with a team or with the teachers. I like to consult with the paraprofessionals who are working directly with my students, so that, because you're the ones who are kind of right there with them, and I might be able to provide just a few tips or tricks to work with them to help them reach the success that we want to see in a particular goal area. So that is one that you will probably see specialists coming to, or hopefully they will, and if not, you should go to them, to, again, implement in the classroom or in the moment the types of strategies that we might want to see. For this second section, the B section, the special ed and related services in the classroom, you may be asked to implement lessons regarding whatever the services are. So this is another area that you could be specifically involved in. And then finally, for this other one, this is when kids are taken out of the classroom to go to whatever special services they have. So for reading instruction or speech language, they might leave for physical therapy. You could also be involved in this. So certain students, their paraprofessional will sit in on a therapy session so that you can either help to manage behaviors, or because you might be asked to carry over the skills into the classroom or into other situations. So 3 areas where we provide services to our students, and you could potentially be involved in all of them.
And these services, once we say we're going to provide them, we're legally obligated to provide them.
Yep. Okay, so back to this idea of accessing the IEP. You know, as Steph said earlier, you need to get your hands on either a physical or online copy of them. But you need to have this so that you know the goals and objectives, and so that you know the accommodations. And you should plan to have a discussion with your teacher to make sure that you're providing the appropriate accommodations and working on the right goals within that classroom. In some schools, you'll be making sure the teachers know what the accommodations are and the goals that they need to be working on. So, you know, I would like to say that, yes, the teachers are going to come to you and say, here you go, this is what we're working on. But really, from a practical reality, it may be that you'll be saying to the teachers, hey, listen, we need to be working on this, or this is an accommodation for this student. In our experience, more in the elementary and middle schools, the teachers will give you the information that you need. And that's kind of just based on the nature of the smaller setting and kind of the team-based settings. It just allows for more connection to one educator. In the high school settings, you're pretty much on your own to find the information, especially since there's a larger setting and there are so many people who are working independently. You may not be connected to just one teacher. You may not have a lead paraprofessional. So you might just kind of be on your own to find out this information. But it is pretty important that you find out this information one way or another. Again, because you're working so closely with these students, you're really the ones who know them and know them well. And you're right there to help them with the accommodations that they need.
Okay, so MCAS. Almost all our students take the MCAS, and you may be required to proctor the MCAS. The accommodations that are given to a particular student on the MCAS are decided at their IEP meeting, and they must be used during the year. So they could get use of a calculator, a word processor, an additional reference sheet, one-on-one, a reader. So there's accommodations that can be provided to the student. On the day of testing, there should be in your folder, if you're proctoring, a list of the accommodation page from the IEP for each student that you have. And that's going to tell you what their accommodations are. I tend to try and look at that maybe a week or so before, just so I get familiar with the student that I have, or if it's a small group, I can think about the possible pitfalls that may happen in that small group and how I want to seat those students. But I think it's always good to get a look about a week before, just so you know how you can plan it.
Okay, so welcome to the wonderful, strange and wonderful world of specialists. As I said earlier, I really like to collaborate with the paraprofessionals because you are the professionals who often know the students best. So
one other thing I would like to say, and this has nothing to do with the fact that Helen is a speech and language. If you need to talk to somebody who has a really good knowledge of most of the accommodations, modifications, special ways of working with kids, and your building has a speech and language pathologist, they are a go-to person. I won't say they know everything, but pretty close to it.
And most of us want to collaborate. It's kind of the nature of what we do. We want to talk with you. So come find us if you need us. So all of the people listed here, and I didn't list every specialist. There may be more, but these are your best line of collaboration. You know, we talk a lot now these days about interprofessional collaboration, and a lot of the research is telling us that that is the most effective way that we can reach our students and help them learn best when we're all involved. So these are the people who really should be there for you or that you should seek out when it comes to working with our special ed students. It's important for you to understand that you're not alone. I think that sometimes when it comes to the whole special ed and working with the special ed students, you can sometimes feel like you're just thrown in there without any direction, without anyone to kind of answer your questions. Well, this is a list of people who can potentially answer questions for you and provide some guidance. You know, again, we go into it because we want to help people, and when you don't have the information that you need, we can start to feel like we're not being effective in our jobs, and we don't want that. None of us wants that. We all want to feel like that when we come to the table, we are bringing the contributions that we want to. So this is another way to help make your contributions a little bit more effective. So you're not alone. The other thing we need to consider is that special ed students are not just like their students. So whether you're a special ed instructor, instructional assistant, or you're attached to a regular ed classroom, we're really trying to get away from this idea of they're your students versus our students. So as the paraprofessional in a classroom, no matter what your official title, you can be helping the special education students and the general education students. You can give a lot of really valuable input surrounding grouping or whether or not the students are accessing the curriculum. So together, all of us strangers, can really be effective if we communicate with each other. So my suggestion to you is if they don't seek you out, seek them out.
Did we try to cover this?
We kind of did, didn't we?
Yeah.
I think we kind of covered this. So we're going to just shoot by it.
So on the specialist front, really make an effort to get close to your specialists. Working with Helen, I can go to her with any question. Doesn't matter if it's a kid on an IEP or a student not on an IEP. Mm-hmm. I get wonderful information from her about how to handle particular situations, how to help students, and she's always willing to give time. So I would say, you know, make the specialists your friends.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, if you have common planning time with a teacher, you're really fortunate because it doesn't happen often.
Right.
Very often common planning time is 5 minutes during lunch or when you see someone walking to the bathroom.
Yep.
So again, it's nice if you can have it. During that common planning time, if you can talk to your teacher about what's going to be happening during the week, previewing the work for the week, and for classwork, getting an answer key for things that you might not be all that familiar with or might be new, so that you can help the student understand what the teacher is actually looking for in certain exercises or questions. Setting goals and priorities with the teacher is also really important because, again, you have unique knowledge and intimate knowledge of what your students can do and where their head is at any point in time. So this is, it's so important. Your input is, I keep saying that, but your input is so important from a teacher's perspective. And again, you see things that teachers might not.
Right. Okay, so I want to talk just for a minute about how we collaborate. And I really want to stress that you should try to meet with your teacher as early in the year as possible and talk about what your expectations are. Sometimes the professionals in the room will just start working together without really outlining what the expectations are. So you might expect that you will be working with small groups and you know, providing some of the instruction, while the teacher, who may not have worked with you before, may expect that you will sit in the back and only work with those kids. So you may expect that you'll be working with all of the students throughout the room, and the teacher may have a very different understanding of what your role is. So one of the things that we have found across time is that if you can come in, even with a written list of what it is that you expect that you will be doing and maybe that you won't be doing, that can be very helpful. It can feel a little awkward when you first start doing something like this, but over really does help with each of you understanding what you bring to the table. So preferably you do this early so that there's no confusion as the year goes on.
Different school systems have different contracts with different duties.
Right.
And sometimes teachers are not aware of what is in a paraprofessional's contract.
Right.
And that really does make a difference, because it's not that they want to give you all of this work. It's just they may not understand that that is not in your contract, and they should know that.
Right. And it is well within your right to be able to say that, so that, again, you all feel comfortable in the classroom, and so that our students get what they need. That's really what the collaboration is all about. And if you work together well, or if you work together whether you don't really care for each other or not, but as long as you understand where each other's coming from, that will make things better for all of the students in the classroom. So on that note, let's talk about some of our possible glitches that can happen in collaboration.
So the first one up there is that we're not doing our job. And I'm going to say that the people that have registered for this webinar are obviously doing their job, because they're interested in spending their own time to get a better understanding of the IEP, and we're very grateful for that. But everybody knows, you know, people in your building that you're like working really hard and turn around and you go, so we're just going to leave that one. The teacher is controlling. So that's one of the women or men that tell you that you're going to sit in the back of the room, in the corner with your students, and go make photocopies for her or him. This is a hard one, and I think the best way to get around this is to, again, right at the start of the year, have a list of what you expect to be doing in the classroom, have a meeting with your teacher, set the boundaries as soon as you can, and you can always expand your role if you choose to, if you don't mind going to make the photocopies. So some of the teachers will not recognize students' disabilities. They'll call students lazy and decide that they should fail. And they haven't really understood the student. So in that case, a conversation with them about what the student is doing, what his accommodations and modifications are on the IEP, and put in some positives about the positive changes that have come. Hopefully there are some, the positive changes that have come for this student, because that's going to make the teacher hopefully more comfortable and really start to understand them. We're not really told about legal ramifications for decision making. We're not the deciders. If we become the deciders, we open ourselves up for legal action if things don't go well. So when you see a problem, go to your teacher, go to your SLP, go to your department head, and try and work that through. Again, as Helen said, you may not like each other. That meeting at the beginning of the year, in this case, is even more critical, so that you can say, we're never going to be social, but this is how we can learn to work together.
Yeah.
And we're not the teacher, so we don't assume that role ever.
So again, this idea of clear communication is really important when you're working with any professionals. I try not to make an assumption about where anybody is coming from, and I will clearly state where I'm coming from, and I'll ask, so what do you think? What would you like me to be doing? What do you see my role as? So that ideally we can not have to deal with these glitches at all from the beginning. All right, so we have come to the end of our journey through the IEP. We really want to thank you for being here with us and giving up part of your Saturday morning. It's pretty awesome. We are passionate in what we do. We are passionate in working with each other, and passionate about the idea that all of us come together to help our students succeed. And when we do come together, it's really pretty powerful. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you.